With that all said, we can go ahead and start talking about what we're going to talk about, what we're here to talk about, which is unmasking and forming connections. And the subtitle that was decided on for this one is A Neurospicy Guide to Finding Community. Because if you're anything like me, being trans, it can be sometimes hard to find community, especially community that you feel safe and comfortable with. And when you're also neurodivergent, that can add to the complication, right? Being trans is a challenge. Being neurodivergent is a challenge. When you put the two together, the challenges can multiply. So what I want to talk about with you all today is how we can navigate this and how we can navigate it together. So that's the plan. And for those of you who don't know me, I'll tell you a little bit about me. I see a lot of familiar names in the chat, but also a lot of new ones, which is really exciting. I'll take a quick note to say during the recording, because this is being recorded now, I'm not going to read any names off of the messages that come in the chat, just for privacy reasons. But once we stop recording and we get to the after-party social space, then it'll be a different story. But my name is Lee, and I can assure you that is indeed how it's pronounced. I picked it. I decide how it's pronounced. It is Lee. And what am I? Well, I'm a philosophy instructor at New Mexico State University. I also help run a dialectical therapy program that is neuro-inclusive and queer-centered through a virtual practice in Pennsylvania called Grow Through Change. I also run a queer-centered, neuro-inclusive coaching and consulting practice called Transcendence Coaching. And I am a peer facilitator here at Plume, working with the quadragenarian population, running some of our E+ or feminizing hormone peer support groups. And I also do offerings like this pretty much every month. I am also a PhD in philosophy, certified sexuality counselor, certified through the Sexual Health Alliance, certified as a mindfulness instructor through the Mindfulness Institute for Emerging Adults, and also certified as a philosophical consultant through the National Philosophical Counseling Association. And in terms of identity, the lenses through which I experience the world and all the thoughts that I'll be sharing with you tonight, I do identify as a non-binary trans feminine person. Sometimes I'll say trans woman. In my experience, I don't differentiate between the two. In terms of my orientation, I am both a romantic and asexual. We just wrapped up a romantic spectrum awareness week. So if any of y'all out there are on the arrow spec, solidarity. Good to see y'all. I am also neurodivergent. So I am autistic. I also am ADHD. Though I don't like the name ADHD, because in my experience, it's not a deficit of attention, nor is it a disorder. It's a surplus of attention in my experience. And it's not so much a disorder as it is a disabling condition because the world was not built for minds that function like mine. I also have a few other forms of neurodivergence. I have what's called visuospatial dysnosia, which means I can't locate myself in space and I get lost a lot. But more fundamental than any of these things, and the one that I think is most important to note, is that even though I'm queer, even though I'm neurodivergent, I am also white. So I experience a very white version of queerness. I experience a very white version of neurodivergence. And I think it's important to note that, because it'll be a factor in my perspectives and my offerings, whether I note it or not, and things like that left unnoted can start to cause problems. So always like to acknowledge that as much as possible up front. So that's just a little bit about me, a little bit about where I've been, and a little bit about the perspectives, identities, and viewpoints that basically inform everything that I do. But enough about me, because we're not here to talk about me. Here's our agenda. I want to talk through 5 topics with you all tonight. I want to talk about masks and closets. I want to talk about internalized ableism. I want to spend some time thinking about community connections. Before that, we'll talk about making spaces. I got out of order a little bit there. And then at the end, I want to talk about how we can move forward, both individually and collectively. So that's our agenda for the evening. Let's start at the beginning. Masks and closets. So I don't know about you all, but I mentioned I'm neurodivergent, I'm autistic, etc. I'm also trans, And in my experience, these things are not distinct. In my experience, these things are absolutely connected. And I don't think my neurodivergence would manifest in the same way if I were not trans. And I absolutely think that my trans identity experience would manifest quite differently if I were not neurodivergent. And my experience of pushing down or hiding these aspects of myself in the past, I realize now in retrospect, have absolutely overlapped. I've put on a mask. I've hid in closets. And oftentimes I wore that mask in the closet, and it almost felt like the closet was the mask and the mask was the closet. They were very, very, very similar things, almost inseparable. Maybe you've had a similar experience. Lots of folks experience something similar to this and describe it in similar ways. One person who describes things in similar ways is Devin Price, who I've talked about in these webinars before. If you're not familiar with his work, I absolutely recommend checking it out. Fantastic thinker when it comes to queerness, neurodiversity, neurodivergence, and all sorts of other topics. So here's a kind of lengthy quote from Devin Price. I don't usually like to put up a whole big block of text, but I think this is a good one to look at. So this is from Devin's book, Unmasking Autism, Discovering the New Faces of Neurodiversity. It says, when an autistic person is not given resources or access to self-knowledge, and when they're told their stigmatized traits are just signs that they're a disruptive, overly sensitive, or annoying kid, they have no choice but to develop a neurotypical facade. And that word there jumps out at me so much, facade, because that, in my experience, is exactly what it felt like, feels like. Maintaining that neurotypical mask feels deeply inauthentic, and it's extremely exhausting to maintain. In my experience, maybe yours, I didn't even notice the exhaustion because I thought it was normal. I only realized how exhausted I was once I reflected on what I had been doing without realizing it. Because as Devin continues, it's not necessarily a conscious choice, this masking. Masking is a state of exclusion forced onto us from the outside. Now here the comparison with queerness comes in. A closeted gay person doesn't just decide one day to be closeted. They're essentially born into the closet because heterosexuality is normative, and being gay is treated as a rare afterthought or an aberration. Similarly, autistic people, or more broadly, neurodivergent people, are born with the mask of neurotypicality pressed against our faces. And oof, that hits me in my bones. Maybe you too, maybe not. Either way, it's okay. But I really, really like these words from Devin Price. And I sat with them for a while today, thinking about them, reflecting on them, as I was thinking about what sort of direction I wanted to go in this part of the discussion. But I think so much is already said right here. But we can unpack it a little bit. So this overlap of neurodivergence and queerness, it's really striking. I talked about this in a webinar from a few months ago, but for anyone who wasn't there, we can dig it up a little bit, return. So neurodivergence and queerness have a lot in common, both in terms of identity, experience, and marginalization. And in fact, when you look at the history of the way queerness is understood in medical contexts and the continued move toward demedicalization, depathologization, stopping treating being a gender or sexual minority as some kind of medical defect, we see very similar trends in neurodivergence, where we're moving further and further away from stigmatizing medicalized or pathological models of folks who have neurotypes that are anything but neurotypical. But the marginalization is also very similar. Queer folk, neurodivergent folk experience very similar, very related forms of marginalization and oppression. But given that these are also likely deeply connected, it's not just an accident that these things are so similar, but we see substantial overlap in the population. Neurodivergent persons are significantly more likely to be queer. And queer persons are significantly more likely to be neurodivergent. And there's all sorts of ways that we can explain that or try to explain it. Right? Neurodivergent people might be sort of people who are more likely to see through or be unmoved by arbitrary social norms, like the construction of heteronormative and cisnormative dictates from dominant culture. We see them, but we're a little bit less likely to be felt to comply, which leads to a sense of gender and sexual expansiveness that neurotypical folks might not allow themselves to explore. And similarly with queer folk, or with queer folks being much more likely to be neurodivergent, as queer individuals, as gender and sexual minorities, we often are very open to exploring the identity and learning and accepting new things about ourselves. So some of the hesitance that the general population might have toward claiming a neurodivergent lens for self-understanding, we're already a little bit primed because we've done similar exploration with our queerness. But now, when we push down, when we hide or deny our neurodivergence in an attempt to be read as neurotypical by others, to have a sort of sensory, cognitive, emotional makeup and set of behaviors that are deemed normal by society, acceptable, respectable, right? We're said to be masking. We put on the neurotypical mask. And that is, in effect, to quite literally push down, hide, or deny our neurodivergence, which is to say it's to push down, hide, or deny our particular needs. Our sensory needs, our cognitive needs, our somatic needs, our emotional needs. Not just wants, but needs. Needs that we deserve to have fulfilled. Now, masking, since it involves sort of pushing aside or denying of needs, obviously can take a lot of energy. And it can be a huge emotional, physical, and existential drain. If you don't know you're masking, you might not realize how tired you are. Right? Or if you know how tired you are, you might someday realize, oh, I've been masking. And then that gives you an explanation for what's been going on. Right? Or if you've already worked through some of the stuff in your own experience, you might notice days where you have to mask a lot might hit very different than days where you can be a little more open and free. And the effects of that drain can add up and be quite detrimental to our overall well-being and ability to flourish over time. And just as with masks, so is with closets. When we push down, hide, or deny our queerness in an attempt to be read as cisgender heterosexual by others, which many of us, I'm sure, have done, maybe we still have to do it, right? We're said to be in the closet. And I don't need to tell you that being in the closet can lead to that very similar emotional, physical, existential drain that can likewise prove to be very detrimental over time. So when we mask, that's a burden on us. When we're in a closet, that's a burden on us. But when we're masked in the closet, or when we come out of a closet only to have to put on a mask, right? All of these are compromises to our freedom, our autonomy, our agency, and our ability to flourish. We deserve better. Not to say the world's always going to cooperate, but we do deserve better. No one needs to live in a closet. No one needs to live hiding behind a mask. So I'm going to open it up now. I'd like to hear some of your reflections, if you don't mind sharing in the chat, right? It's opt-in, so share if you're comfortable or if you feel so moved. But I'm curious, do masks feel similar to closets for you? Or are they different? Do they feel like the same thing? Do they affect you in different ways? What is your experience? I see one acknowledgement of the stress here in the chat, potentially tying to becoming type 1 diabetic. I'm sorry to hear it, friend. But yeah, see, one of you says definitely can see the correlation. Masks are easier to put on and off in outside situations, right? Yeah, and I think that's one thing to note. Like being in the closet versus not being in the closet can really affect our like physical presentation. Like back when I was in a closet, I didn't dress the way I do now, right? I'm wearing a skirt. I'm actually wearing a skirt over a dress right now, right? And the outfit, the adornment that I have, when I was closeted, I wouldn't wear this. So it'd be very hard for me to publicly go back in a closet. But masks are different. We can take them on and off almost sometimes as we are demanded to. Right. So there might be a little more flexibility there, right? But I see other people sharing, yes, I was half a person sexually and physically most of my life. So taking off the, oh, it's getting bumped up before I can read. Taking off the sexual first and then the physical made me feel freed from both. Absolutely. Right. I was always told I was different and went out of my way to be. Yeah, this idea that if you're actually unmasking, it must be that you're trying to be different when it really could be that you're just being authentic to you. Right? I see one friend shares, they feel like different things to me, but I also use masking as a term for hiding some of my quote fruity traits growing up. I think I did both pre-transition and only do one now. Yeah, right? We might also use the concept of masking about certain aspects of our queerness. Right. I know when I'm not comfortable around a group of people, the register of my voice drops and it starts to sound more masculine. And that's totally a defense mechanism and potentially a form of masking. It's a way of denying or pushing down or hiding my femininity from the people I'm around who I don't feel safe with. Right? See, the challenge of coming out fully as trans and navigating my neurodivergence has been tough. Well, I'm glad you're here, friend. I'm glad you're here. Right? They feel the same, but the effects are slightly different. Yeah, I love all these shares. Y'all got so much to say. I remember feeling so frustrated throughout my school life, and it always boiled down to being closeted and masking. I don't think I started feeling physically relaxed until I stopped living in both those ways. Yeah, I relate to that. And sometimes we don't even know that we're not relaxed because we don't have a comparison. There are people out there who've never been out of a closet. They don't even know they're in one. There are people out there who've never unmasked because they don't know that they're wearing one. And that exhaustion just feels like everyday life. It's kind of like before my egg cracked, before I realized I was trans. It felt like my shoes were on the wrong feet, but that seemed normal because that's how everyone told me to wear them. I didn't know any different, so I didn't even recognize it as discomfort. I love these answers. I would continue going through all of them. You're welcome to keep sharing, but I'm going to continue just in the interest of time of going on through the material. The second part I want to talk to you about now is internalized ableism. Because maybe you relate, I experience a lot of this. I probably experience more internalized ableism, more self-judgment than I do ableism toward other folks, right? Which of course, I don't consciously practice, but I grew up in an ableist society, so there's no way I am immune from some ableist tendencies. It's just like transphobia. I grew up in a transphobic society, as did all of us. There's still some of that that has been conditioned into me that's going to take a lifetime to unlearn. It's an ongoing process. But some of the transphobia that stings me the most is the internalized transphobia, the stuff I put myself through. Right? Now, there's a thinker named Nick Walker, and she has a book called Neuroqueer Heresies, Notes on the Neurodiversity Paradigm, Autistic Empowerment, and Post-Normal Possibilities. Right? Now, this one's a little wordy, right? But sometimes us autistic folks speak a little wordy, right? I think part of inclusivity is navigating that together. So here's something that Walker points out. Like heteronormative performance, neuronormative performance is a better fit for some folks than for others. Right? This is the idea that most of our public-facing social lives and the way we show identity to other folks involves some kind of performance. That's not to minimalize it. That's not to trivialize it, but it's to say that in large part, identity and the way we project identity is based not just on how we are, but on what we do. Right? And just like this performance that conforms to heteronormativity, right? Neuronormative performance, that is this masking performance as if you're neurotypical, it comes easier to some folks than for others. Walker continues, at one end of the spectrum are those whose innate tendencies and inclinations are compatible enough with their local culture's standards of neuronormative performance that they readily internalize those standards and come to experience their own socially instilled performance of neuronormativity as natural. So another way to think about that, right, is there are folks who navigate this expectation that we all be neurotypical and perform as such. It comes easier to them. They can navigate it with less friction, fewer hurdles. Right? And insofar as they're living up to that standard, they internalize those standards and they start to interpret and experience their own performance as natural. And Walker continues, says, this is what we're really talking about when we refer to someone as neurotypical. And I love this idea because what it says is that neurotypical is not a way that we are born. Neurotypical is just as much a social construct as any part of sexuality or gender. To be neurotypical is to be able to mask without it being disabling. It's to be able to mask without the burden of masking wearing you down. And for some people, that just comes so much more naturally and easily. Right? And in different cultures with different norms and different expectations for performance, neurotypicality is going to look very different. Right? But we can draw from this that what it is to be neurotypical, well, it's a spectrum. We're neurotypical to the degree that masking is not disabling to us. And we are neurodivergent to the degree that masking is disabling to us. Now, I mentioned at the beginning that I don't think the word disability and disorder are synonymous, and I want to return to that because in my experience, I am disabled by my neurodivergence, but it's not a disorder. There's nothing out of order with me. I just live in a world that was built for people who aren't like me and expects me to be like them. This is disabling, right? The idea here is that it's not some sort of medical defect, but the disability is imposed by a society that refuses to accommodate. Not to say we need special treatment, but refuses accessibility, like a building that refuses to install wheelchair ramps. That building is a disabling factor for those who use wheelchairs. So let's back up a little bit, slow down a little. Ableism, right? How can we think about what's going on with this word ableism? Well, here's how I like to think about it. Maybe this will work for you too. It's an individual or cultural attitude, conscious or unconscious, according to which those disabled, physically, mentally, emotionally, or otherwise, by the arrangement of dominant culture, by the way things are set up, are seen and treated by that dominant culture as in some way deviant, defective, or deficient. We are othered. We are seen as less than or as wrong because we are disabled physically, mentally, emotionally, or otherwise by the arrangement of dominant culture. Those attitudes, that's ableism. And like I mentioned, just as those of us who grew up in transphobic environments might struggle with internalized transphobia, those of us who grow up in ableist environments likely struggle with internalized ableism. And I'm willing to bet that that is every single one of us. And this can lead to tensions within the self when it comes to accepting ourselves, and furthermore, accepting our needs as neurodivergent persons. For a long time, so I struggle with misophonia, and I get very, very easily overwhelmed when there are multiple sources of sound. I was out at a discussion group last night, and there was music playing from somewhere. And we couldn't tell where it was coming from. And this was unbearably difficult to me to the point where I could not continue with the meeting. But as soon as we figured out the sound source, it was from the house across the street, it didn't bother me at all anymore. There, the struggle was just this sort of inability to locate where it was, which was deeply off-putting for me, physically uncomfortable. Now, before, I would have been embarrassed by this. I would have put myself down and said, why can't I just deal with it? This is so silly. But I've learned, no, that's the internalized ableism talking. That experience, that sensory difficulty, is very real for me. And if I wouldn't criticize a friend for coping with it, why am I going to criticize myself for prioritizing it as a genuine need? Before, when I used to go hang out with friends in like crowded bar environments, I'm coming up on a year sober, so I don't do that anymore. But I would have such a difficult time talking to folks at a table because there'd be multiple conversations. And as a result, I couldn't hear any of them. There were too many sound sources. And I would try to smile and nod and act as if I was listening and act as if I was present. And this was so exhausting for me. And I didn't understand how anyone else could hear anything that was happening. And I always assumed, I never talked to anyone about this. I assumed I just was a bad listener, or I assumed that I should just, I don't know, deal with it. But then I decided, no, I'm going to get myself some specialty earplugs that block out ambient noise. I let myself have that. I let myself invest in that. And let me tell you, it helped tremendously. I put them in, and it is like an instant soothe to my nervous system. I give you these examples just to really highlight a phenomenon you might be familiar with, which is when we're struggling with accepting ourselves, we oftentimes deprioritize our own needs because we don't see them as needs. And in doing so, we basically commit the violence of institutionalized ableism against ourselves. But the nice thing is that we can start to unlearn this internalized ableism. It's going to take conscious effort and intentional deconstruction of the influences that have shaped us. It's not a switch we can flip. It's not like we're just going to be like, well, I'm not going to be ableist. No more internalized ableism, right? We can't just like purge it overnight, but it's still possible to unlearn. Not all the way. There might always be bits, but we can think of this process of unlearning as a constant practice, something we're always striving for. And it's a practice that's both individual and communal. When I work toward unlearning ableism and you work toward unlearning ableism and we start working together toward unlearning ableism, we can make even more progress. But the first step in that progress is naming it and recognizing it for what it is. So are we, when we say, oh, I'm silly, I shouldn't need this, are we really perpetuating that neuro-exclusionary ableist norm? And if so, are we doing anyone any favors? Or are we doing violence? I'd love to open it back up into the chat and ask, this is maybe a little more sensitive question, but what does your inner ableist voice sound like? Mine sounds like my dad. Mine is my dad's voice. And the question also, when does it tend to speak up? For me, I only really feel it when I'm in social situations. And I feel it when I'm in social situations where the power dynamics aren't clear. Right? If I'm a professor in front of a classroom or if I'm a musician on stage, I understand. I don't get that inner ableist voice. But if I'm sitting around a table in a group conversation, then it speaks up loud and I hear my dad in my ear telling me all of these things about myself. Right? So if any of you all want to share, please feel free. See, this first question I see is which inner ableist voice? Yeah, they definitely can sometimes feel like a small army. Right? I see other folks relating to it being a parent, so parents or a mother's voice. I see dad and the voice of society itself. Mine sounds like the perfect neurotypical version of myself whenever I'm in a stressful position. So like a counterpart of you speaking to yourself dismissively in a derogatory fashion. Wow. Hmm. See, my mother, she raised me and expected me to be the person she wanted to be. She wanted to be. And if I wasn't my own person, but a full representation of her, wow. Hmm. See a share here. I don't know how to differentiate it from my own. I think it's just me holding myself to high standards like I do in every way. I'm sure a lot of folks here can relate to that. There's this sort of, you know, this voice of perfectionism, which doesn't do us any favors, can really, really hold us back insofar as it wears us down. But it's very real, very real. Another share, so much of the time there aren't words or a true voice. It's just a wince as a realization of a memory or something I did, quote, wrong pops up. Yeah, you might feel it not as a voice in your head, but as a wince in your body. So instead of hearing it in brain, you hear it, feel it in heart or gut. And this notion of doing something wrong, I'm curious how many of y'all would relate to the experience of waking up one day and looking back and wondering, was I weird? Was I awkward? Thinking back to a conversation or experience you had the day before. Odds are you probably were at some point and weren't at others, just like everyone is, because every human being is awkward and weird at some points, and that's a beautiful thing, and we can embrace that. It's part of what keeps life interesting, right? But sometimes that voice can drown out all the others. Right? I see a share here. This morning, I reintroduced myself to a coworker whom I've worked with for months now. They weren't wearing glasses and got a piercing. I made brief eye contact and assumed they were someone else. Trying to practice self-love, but old habits die hard. I called myself a clown all day, even out loud. Oh, friend, be gentle with you, please. You deserve it. You deserve it. I feel it more than I hear it. It's like a shock to my throat and chest. Yep, yep. Like a little zap or a jolt. I really appreciate y'all sharing. I know this can be sensitive stuff to share about. So thank you for everyone for showing up in the way that's best for you, whether that be using the chat or reflecting on your own, in place of sharing. Either one is absolutely wonderful. Let's go on to the next section. You can keep sharing if you'd like. I want to talk about making spaces. We talk a lot about trying to find spaces, find trans community, find neurodivergent community, find accessible community. These spaces only exist if someone makes them. They're not the default. And for some of us, finding them can be really hard and frustrating. And it might be easier for us to make them. And that can sound daunting. That can sound like a really big project. But we can do it. There are steps. There is a process. And here I want to return to Devin Price from his next book, which actually isn't even out yet, but it's coming out very soon. And I'm so, so excited to read it because, as you might be able to tell, I'm a fan. This is from the book Unmasking for Life, The Autistic Person's Guide to Connecting, Loving, and Living Authentically. I see so much of myself in this, so I'm very excited to share this quote with you. It says, as I learned more about autism and got to know myself as a disabled person a bit better, decades of emotional repression and complex trauma burst from deep within. Suddenly, I became a person who called in sick to work for the sake of my mental health and cried myself to sleep at night while clutching stuffed animals. I stopped wearing painfully tight skirt suits and chopped off my long, scratchy hair. I began working alone in the dark at odd hours and climbing underneath the bed to hide when ambulances blared too loudly on my street. These were things I had always craved doing, but had feared would make me seem pathetic, childish, or attention-seeking. I read that and my jaw dropped. Because I wouldn't have written it as well, but I could have written that paragraph. Right? My examples would be different, as yours likely would be too. But once I understood myself as autistic, as neurodivergent, there was so much emotion that came up for me. Just like when my egg cracked and I realized I was trans. Because it was, for me, 3.5 decades of pushing stuff down and then finally letting it come up. Finally letting myself feel it for the first time. That's a lot of feelings to feel all at once. It can be overwhelming. But what Devin is saying here is it's not that realizing that he was autistic made him call into work or made him cry himself to sleep at night while clutching stuffed animals. What he was doing now was giving himself permission to do those things. Giving himself permission to clutch the stuffed animals, which otherwise we might see as childish, right? As out of the norm, as something that we would be embarrassed by. Working alone in the dark at odd hours, some people may be like, that's weird. But no, if it works for you, it's not weird. It may be atypical given society's dominant expectations, but society's dominant expectations can kick rocks if they don't serve us. Right? So much of the traits associated with neurodivergence are linked with being pathetic, childish, or attention seeking, doing it just for attention, right? Or having your very deep special interests, like a hyper focus on a particular topic. One of mine is Godzilla, right? A lot of people see that as childish. Is it childish or is it freedom? Is it freedom to actually explore what you really care about and what gives you joy? And how much do we harm ourselves by pushing that down and pretending for the sake of others like it's not there? So if we give ourselves permission to unmask, what are we going to start letting ourselves do? I think this is a beautiful question. Right? With the stuffed animals, I always had stuffed animals when I was a child, and they were a great source of comfort for me. I could not sleep without them. But then I grew up and I couldn't have them anymore. But a while ago, I was like, you know what? No, I want these for me. I sleep better when I have a stuffed xenomorph, a stuffed Chucky doll, a stuffed Godzilla, and a stuffed face hugger, right? So that's my little stuffy collection that I sleep with at night. And I remember at one point, this was years ago, my mother was like, son, she was confused back then too. What are you going to do when you have a guest over and they see these stuffed animals? Hinting that it would be seen as pathetic, childish. And I remember responding, well, if it's a problem for them, then they serve their purpose. Right? If someone is going to come into my life and be like, oh, you sleep with stuffed animals? That's weird. Then that is not a person I'm going to invest my energy in. So it's actually a pretty good litmus test when I have a quote, as she put it, guest over. But in terms of making these spaces, right? The first step in making spaces is really committing to practicing neuroinclusivity. So just as we practice openness and inclusivity regarding queerness, we can actively practice neuroinclusivity, right? An appreciation of all aspects of the neurodiverse landscape, decentering neurotypicality and honoring all sorts of different neurotypes. And this involves not just affirming neurodivergent identity and experience. That's a big part of it, but there's more. It also involves actively considering and implementing accommodations that can make spaces and interactions more accessible for neurodivergent persons. So I help run a community center, and it's not enough in that center for us to just put up signs saying, we love neurodivergent people, and to pat autistic people on the back when they come in. No, we got to be mindful of our lighting. We got to think about our sound sources. We got to think about what food we stock our shelves with. So there's affirmation when we're being neuroinclusive, but then there's also actively considering and implementing accommodations. Because as neurodivergent folks, we do often have particular emotional, sensory, somatic, or cognitive needs. And someone can say your identity is valid all they want, but if they're not sensitive to those needs, that is not allyship. That is not inclusivity. So one of the first things we can do is really lead by example and start practicing that. For ourselves and for others, think about others. Suppose you have a neurodivergent friend who struggles with, say, sensory processing or with social interactions. Ask yourself, how would you help them? How would you contribute to making the situation more accessible or less aversive to them? In short, how would you support? And these aren't hypothetical questions. These are real questions to think about. If you're out with a friend and they're starting to have sensory overload to the point that it might lead to some variety of shutdown, how are you going to help them? If you're with a friend at a party and they really struggle with social interactions, are you going to let them fend for themselves? Or are you going to kind of assist them? Maybe stay with them, help introduce them to people, intentionally loop them into conversations, have a code word for when they need to escape and you can maybe go support them. These are questions we ask when we're being a good friend. And our friends deserve good friends. Right? But you know who else deserves good friends? You do. I do, you do, we all do. We all deserve good friends. And we can be a good friend to ourselves. Not to say that we will be our only friend, but our other friends are going to have a hard time being good to us if we're not already a good friend to ourselves. Because then we make their job harder. Taking up space by speaking up about your needs and helping yourself to accommodations is not selfish. I repeat, it is not selfish or negative in any way. Neurotypical people help themselves to their needs and accommodations freely. Our needs and accommodations are just a little more atypical, so we might feel some kind of way, selfish or negative, in reaching out for those needs, speaking up about them. Right? But it's not selfish. Right? If your own inner voice says it is selfish, let my voice speak over that inner voice. Right? Hear Lee in your head saying, no, you deserve to take up space. There is nothing wrong with taking up space. So if you're open to sharing in the chat, I'd like to brainstorm a little bit here. What kind of spaces would you like to find? And what kind of spaces would you like to build? Would you like to find a community center where you can talk about activism? Would you like to find a chess club? Would you like to find a group where you can sit around quietly and read books? Would you like to find a group that just goes around cleaning each other's houses without even talking? Or maybe you'd like to find a group that rides bikes and sort of things while you do it. Right? What kind of spaces would you like to find or build that you feel would satisfy your particular needs or scratch the sort of itches that you have for community? Ready to join the trans army and start fighting back? Well, let me go ahead and enlist you, my friend, because we are Legion. Mhm. A journaling club, right? Imagine that, a journaling club where people meet in a space. They body double, which is to say that they share the space physically, which can be co-regulating, but everyone's working on their own individual journaling. Right? So you're passively sharing space. You're being social and you're getting social connection, but there's no expectation of conversation or overt activity. You can do that. Right? Some people might be like, that sounds boring. Boring for them. That could be life-changing for us. Right? So I love that idea of a journaling club. Now I kind of want to start one. I already often do sit with friends at coffee shops and we both write in journals. Doing that with a whole group of people in a room sounds amazing to me. Right? I see a share here actually sort of toying with creating a space like this with a neurodivergent friend activist in the Pacific Northwest. Community living for neurodivergent creatives working collaboratively. Love that. I want to see it. I want to see it. Oh, any group where I didn't disappear. Felt. A writing club for queer folk. Yeah, absolutely. That can be a lot like the journaling one. Maybe it's a creative writing club. Maybe it's a poetry group where instead of it being led, it's freeform, it's self-paced, but you do it in a shared space. You have friends who you meet up with at a library room once a month, and the idea is you just go and sit there and write together. Right? I see a share here. Generally felt my heart break a little when I imagine a place that pays attention to their lighting. I guess it's the little things. Lighting makes such a huge difference. Lighting can be extremely violent, right? I do love the idea of a silent chess club as well. Much better at games than meeting people. So, one thing that often makes neurodivergent spaces accessible for neurodivergent folk is that they are more activity oriented. It's not just general socializing, but it's centered around an activity. And this can make it more accessible because it makes it so that when we go there, we have more of an idea of what to expect. There's less surprise and there's more prep work we can do to cope in advance and regulate in advance. So finding things like game nights, chess clubs, bicycling groups, book clubs, where you know you'll be talking about a particular book, these things can be so much more accessible than just general meetups. Yeah. See, a place with fields of flowers and taking stop to smell the roses to a reality, just going around and smelling all the different flowers and reflecting. My goodness, that warms my heart. I want to do that too. Absolutely do. Now, all of these spaces, the thing is, if they're not around you, if you have the energy, if you have the spoons, you can maybe start them, right? If there's a Reddit thread for, I mean, careful on Reddit because it can be rough, but if there's a Reddit thread for your town, maybe just say, starting ND Chess Club, and people who know will know. You can get some contact, and things like that, little steps can turn into big leaps. So, those little steps turning into big leaps, they can lead to community connections. But one of the most beautiful things I've found is through actively building neuro-inclusive community in my local community center. There is such a variety of fascinating people who come in, and they come in because they feel safe coming in and being themselves in a way that they don't feel safe going in and being themselves anywhere else. It's a space where we all prioritize the permission and ability to unmask, right? And at times, our particular needs conflict. The way that someone stims might absolutely activate some of my own sort of dysregulation mechanisms, but we can negotiate that, right? So you can build these connections. There's a quote here by Janara Nuremberg from a book called Divergent Mind, Thriving in a World That Wasn't Designed for You. Now, this book is specifically about autistic women, but so much of what is written in it generalizes beyond women. Right? It says here, and I love this because it's a preemptive call out for so many of these kinds of webinars who do exactly this. It's not enough to say we need more connection or to point out that loneliness is a problem. We all know that. We need to know how to connect, which means learning how to have better conversations with others and reveal ourselves to others more fully. Sharing our struggles, especially our mental health ones, is a direct path to connection. Not everyone will know how to respond or what to say, but by opening your door, you open theirs. You help open theirs. It can take time, but soon everyone in your circle of family, friends, or colleagues will feel a little more at ease being themselves. The amount of stress decreases, and we're healthier and more connected as a result. Not long ago, a trans man came into my community center that I help run. Young trans man, never met him before. Came in to check out the space, and he said to me, "Hey, I've actually seen you before. I've seen you walking around our college campus, and you look so confident and calm that it makes me feel better about being on campus." And I don't say that to pat myself on the back, though it did feel good to hear. But that is an example of being open, helping open doors for other people too. I carry a stim toy on my purse. My purse hangs around my hip, and I have a big carabiner on it because I need people to know I'm a lesbian. And on that, I have a little circle, a little like collection of chainmail rings, and it's right at hand level. So as I'm walking, I can manipulate those rings between my fingers, and it absolutely helps self-soothe. And people ask me about it. They're like, what is that? And I explain it to them. I explain what it is. And more of my friends are getting similar things, helping themselves to stim toys in their bags or on their keychain. This is an example of tending to our needs and being open about it in a way that inspires other people to do the same. So, when we want to build community connections, the first step to connecting in community is to make note of one, what kind of community you want. Seriously ask that. What are you looking for? And be honest, be descriptive. Right? Community is a big word and it can mean a lot of things. Are you looking for folks to sit together and watch movies? Are you looking for some people to go out to eat with? Are you looking for people to play games with and socialize? Or are you looking for people to play games with while you all have your headphones in? Be honest about what kind of community you're looking for. And then ask, what steps do you need to do to take, what do you need to take in order to find or build that community? Right? What would looking around your local area or online, because online community is just as much community as in-person is, right? What would it take to try to find something like that? And if you can't find it, how could you start to build it? Or if that's too much pressure, ask, how would someone start to build it? Where might they get the word out? How might they advertise? Where might this group meet? Start to just come up with some answers, even tentative ones, to those sorts of questions. And then after that, ask yourself, 3, what barriers are currently in the way when it comes to taking those steps? Is it social anxiety? Is it that you're just so tired? Is it executive function, not playing alone? Right? Is it that the place you want to go is maybe a little bit aversive when it comes to, say, the lighting or the sound? Brainstorm. What are the barriers? Name them. Right? Actually write them down. And then you can make a plan for how you can work around or work with the barriers that you identify. Right? We can't work to erode barriers that we don't name. Right? So name them. And in order to name them, we need to see what they're blocking us from doing, or else we might misidentify them. So we need to think about what we want and what it would take to get there. Now, again, community connection can look like so many things, and we get to choose what kind we want to build or pursue. So ask yourself, what need does community fulfill for you? And what can you offer community? Not that it's transactional, but sometimes if you can see in yourself something that you can offer, whether it's tech skills or a sense of humor, or you're a good cook, or you're a good listener, or you're willing to just sit with someone while they do something else, that can help us feel motivated toward connecting in community, because then we feel like we can give that community a gift. Right? Ask yourself, what does connection feel like at a somatic level in your body? Where do you feel it? Is it a glow in your chest? Do you feel it behind your eyes? Where is that? And let yourself get shamelessly creative in answering these things. Right? Since there is, and there shouldn't be anything like a one-size-fits-all answer. Right? Let it be creative. Let it be individual. And then last column here, we practice, practice, practice. Connection doesn't always come easily. And we set ourselves up for frustration when we expect it to. Right? I've worked with so many folks through my coaching practice and elsewhere who want community and they want it now. And when they try and they don't get it immediately, they give up. And the unfortunate reality is it doesn't come immediately. Not for neurotypical folks and not for neurodivergent folks. Think of this ability to connect as like a muscle. At first, the heavy lifting of doing the social interaction in order to start building community, it might seem like an unbearable strain. Like if I were to walk up and just try to deadlift, like, I don't know how much people deadlift, but a whole lot of pounds, right? But as you keep practicing and keep training, that muscle gets stronger and stronger, right? Social connection is no different. And if you can motivate yourself, perhaps with the help of others, maybe you do it as a team, to take first steps, and maybe take that first step 10, 12 times, right? Progressive steps are going to get easier, right? One of the biggest barriers for neurodivergent people looking for community connections is they talk themselves out of it because they tell themselves they cannot do it. right? It's hard, but hard doesn't mean impossible, and hard doesn't mean not worth trying. So I want to ask, in terms of what you can offer community, the thing that might motivate you to go out and build or find, what do you hope to offer to community? Right? Say my answer, I love the idea of offering comfort and sort of clarity to a community. I'm a teacher, I'm a space holder. And if I can offer that to folks, that gives me motivation to get out there and try to do so. Now, it can be hard to see our own positive attributes and our own positive offerings, but feel free to try. What do you hope to offer to community? Please feel free to share in the chat. Giving a listening ear, right? Sharing my journey, just telling our stories. Virtually holding someone's hand through theirs. Absolutely. I see a share related to the earlier topic. Socializing has become a lot easier for me once I learned to accept not everyone is a good match for me, and that's okay. Amen. Right? I used to have a little bit of a people pleaser tendency where I tried to get everyone to like me. And once I realized that some people won't, not because I'm bad or they're bad, but because our own methods of interaction are just kind of bristly to each other. And that's okay. Well, it got a lot easier. It got a lot easier to show up as me once I was able to push aside the people pleasing. You see more shares on this hope to offer community, just being there for others, being able to listen well, being able to offer humor, levity, being able to offer frankness and candor. I love these answers, and so many of them I see is that you are identifying yourselves as space holders, y'all, just like I did. And I think for us who are neurodivergent folk and trans folk who have probably lived many lives and experienced a lot of things, and we know what it's like to not have space held for us, and we also know how valuable it is when people do. I think many of us want to give that back. And you can, right? And that can be a cornerstone of connection and community. Right? See, when two people aren't understanding each other, I have this instinct to mediate and help them reach common ground. Yeah, we need mediators in community, absolutely. Right? I would love to help someone realize their true self, just like my friend did. I met her online and she was supremely patient with a complete stranger. I'd like to do the same. And you will, friend. You will. Right? Oh, we got a cultural anthropologist in the space. I love that. So teaching the concept of what accepting difference means. Yes, thank you. We need that. We need that. Yeah. Mm. We'll go into the last section briefly, so we have some time to connect in Q&A before we take a break and then go into the after-party social space. So this last section is just taking everything we've talked about and figuring out how to move forward. So this is a quote from two of my favorite thinkers. If you've been to my webinars before, you've heard me cite them, reference them, and praise them many times. Like John Barker and Alex Yantofi. This is from their collaborative book, Life Isn't Binary, on being both, beyond, and in between, which is a book I recommend to absolutely everyone, no matter their identity. Here they're talking about this mad, sane binary. This idea that there are some people who are mentally well, and then there are the people who are not, which is just as much of a nonsense binary as all of the others. So Meg John Barker and Alex Ian Toffey write, in a world where so many of us are struggling with very real social problems, it's vitally important to acknowledge the cultural context we're in and to resist individualizing our suffering. The mad sane binary is very effective in preventing challenges to toxic politics and practices because people are not aware of the social context of their struggles. And because there is a fear that if you do speak out, you will be labeled as, quote, insane or attention seeking or pathetic or childish or weird or wrong. Right? I take the spirit of this quote to really be communicating that when they say we need to resist individualizing our own suffering, that's what I mean when I say that my ADHD is not a disorder. There is nothing disordered about me. but we acknowledge the cultural context we're in. I am in a situation that is broadly incompatible with my manifestation of ADHD. It makes it so that I have a much harder time functioning than the rest of my peers. It's not the ADHD that does that. It is the ADHD in conjunction with the social context, the cultural context. Right? But society enforces this binary. There are people who are sane and there are people who are mad, which includes the traumatized people and the neurodivergent people. And in enforcing that binary, just like the nonsense of the gender binary, right, it makes it so much harder to push back. Because when we do, we're labeled as mad, and then people listen to us less. This is the enemy. So if we're going to move forward, we need to know how to work with it. One step at a time. So connecting in community, especially affirming, accessible community, like I mentioned, it doesn't happen overnight. If you expect it to, the whole process will be that much more frustrating. Let yourself take your time in building a plan and then follow it with a sense of openness and flexibility. Right? And we got to lift each other up, y'all. Super important. We cannot do this alone. We were not designed to do anything alone. Community comes so much easier when community itself comes together and we can do it collaboratively. The more we lift up our neurodivergent peers, including those here, but all of those also elsewhere, right? And including by advocating for ourselves and our needs, the easier it will be for all of us to find spaces, build spaces, and connect in community. Whether that's physical connection in a community center or online on Discord or Signal, which I would recommend, or a Zoom chat. Right? One of the first steps then in connecting in community is striving to be a good community member, striving to be a good friend. Think about how you can help people who are neurodivergent navigate spaces and how you can help you too. And like I mentioned earlier, be gentle with yourself, please. Things like patience, openness, flexibility, keywords I mentioned earlier, all of these things can be very difficult for some neurodivergent folks to navigate. Flexibility can be extremely difficult for those of us who are more comforted by sort of exact planning. Right? Openness can be very difficult for those of us who are a little bit more rigid in our commitments. But like I mentioned just a few minutes ago, this difficulty doesn't mean that it's impossible. Just as it being possible doesn't mean that it won't be difficult. Right? So be gentle with yourself along the way. Be mindful of negative self-talk. And by mindful, I don't mean in some hollow woo-woo sense. I mean, notice when you're doing it. Notice it and name that. Give it a name, maybe. Maybe it's Bob or George. That's the negative voice. And actively tell it to stop. Right? Over and over, the more you do that, you can actually start to take advantage of the neuroplasticity in the brain and start to quell some of that negative self-talk. Right? Be gentle with yourself by not letting your frustrations lead you. Right? And absolutely by not giving into internalized ableism. Right? It harms all of us. So notice it, name it, and maybe commit to gradually, one step at a time, eroding it individually and collectively. So one last question I want to throw into the chat. What does being gentle with yourself look like in practice for you? For me, it involves sometimes just letting that inner voice talk and tuning it out. Right? Because if I tell it to shut up, it just talks over me. So I'm just like, you know what? You can just go, and I'm going to go over here and do this other thing. Or sometimes being gentle with myself involves me going to my friends and saying, hey, I need you right now. I need some help. And not having too much pride to do that. Right? I see an answer here, presenting the way I want and feeling comfortable about it. Yes. Right? And for the friend who shared, I don't know. We'll work together. We can find that. And you can find that. Right? And I see the not a clue, right? Anyone else, if you want to help, offer some suggestions for the folks who might have a hard time with this question. What does it look like for you? Often been described as the no extroverted introvert. So going into a quiet space, even for a few minutes, recharges my battery. Often it boils down to some form of not trying so hard, not pushing myself too hard. Sometimes it's just letting myself drop and not forcing myself to do more than I need to. I want to introduce to you all a concept before we open it up. It's the concept of what's called satisficing. So many of us might feel the need to do everything, to do it all, to be perfect. We might expect ourselves to do more than is expected. It's easy growing up in the culture we live in to see how we could inherit those ideas, but notice that that's incoherent. It's incoherent to expect yourself to do more than is expected. Satisficing is this idea of letting yourself do what is enough and letting enough be enough and recognizing that enough is enough. Through a capitalist lens, the owning class sometimes calls this quiet quitting. It's otherwise doing your job and not doing more, not putting in unpaid labor. Think of all the areas where you can quiet quit, right? Which isn't quitting, right? But it's letting yourself satisfy your criteria and not stress about going above and beyond, right? If you can let go of that need to always do the extra, you can be so much more gentle with yourself. So with that, let's quickly review. We talked about masks and closets, talked about internalized ableism, making spaces, community connections, and a little bit about moving forward. Here are those recommended readings. The reading by Meg John Barker and Alex Leon Toffey, by Janara Nirenberg, the 2 books by Devin Price. I also recommend Devin's other 2 books, Laziness Does Not Exist and Unlearning Shame, and also the book Neuroqueer Heresies, a collection of essays by Nick Walker. If you want to take a screenshot of that, great, or you'll get a copy of this so you can follow up with it later. Here are some other upcoming events. We've got all sorts of cool stuff. One thing that is not listed here is I will be doing an event in March, the next webinar on, I forget what we're calling it, but it's basically going to be on expanding sexuality and intimacy through sort of exploration of kink and BDSM. So I'm very, very excited to chat with folks about that topic because it is something that I spend a lot of time thinking about. So I want to say thank you all for being here, especially folks who shared in the chat. And even if you didn't, thank you for showing up in the way that served you best. We'll take a short break. Before we go on the break, though, I want to take a couple of questions, maybe for 5 minutes. So it says here that we'll start the social space at 6:15 PST. We'll start a little bit late so I can take a couple questions here, and then we'll take a 5-minute break. So if you've got any questions that you want to have addressed in the group before we go into the social space, please feel free. I got one in the Q&A that I'll address here. It says, I've heard people say that ADHD manifests in trans girls by them having feminine traits of ADHD instead of masculine ones. I wanted to ask if it's true or not. Thank you. So thank you. That's a really good question. And I don't know particularly the answer to that, but I will say that the diagnosis of neurodivergence historically, when we're still working in a medicalized framework, is absolutely gendered in some terribly frustrating ways. The joke is that boys get diagnosed with autism and girls get diagnosed with borderline personality disorder. And it's not a joke because it's funny, but it's said as a joke as a way of coping with the unfortunate truth. Right? For a long time, the idea was that the only people who could be neurodivergent or autistic were adolescent boys. And this is because the DSM, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual for sort of diagnosing mental quote, disorders, in that the criteria for autism was cisgender, white, adolescent males. Right? And almost no research was done into other populations. Same thing with ADHD, which some folks will say you can't be diagnosed with as an adult. That is ageist nonsense and a misunderstanding of the neurotype. Right? So when it comes to these, quote, diagnoses of different, neurodivergent manifestations, they are absolutely politicized and rife with different kinds of sexist, transphobic, and ageist bias. which is deeply, deeply frustrating. So I see one question here. We'll do this next question and then we'll go on our break and then we'll come back for the social space. So it shared, I have one major struggle with the social model of disability. Just that there are certain disabilities or symptoms, like some I deal with, where I can't imagine any possible world in which they're somehow no longer disabling. That's not to say there couldn't be accommodations to help, but it feels at the very least incomplete to say that if the world were built differently enough, that the disability per se would no longer exist. I don't know, am I missing something? I really appreciate you bringing this up because this is something that anyone who advocates for a social model of disability, which is this idea that it is the environment that disables us rather than anything intrinsic to us, right, has to reckon with. And for some folks who are neurodivergent, the support needs might be so high that any world in which those support needs are met is so far from actuality, right, that the world would have to be a completely different place, right? And I think a way to think about this is that this is absolutely on a spectrum, right? Most neurodivergent people, like, support needs tend to be, even if difficult, still manageable, right? But there are the sort of outlier cases, not to dismiss them by calling outliers, just saying that they're a little less frequent. Folks whose support needs are almost invariably difficult to fulfill, right? And in that case, one way of thinking about that in the social model is, yes, a world where they receive the support they need is possible. It's just so far from actuality that it's inherently impractical. But a way of then approaching that is not thinking that there is something wrong or broken with this person, but recognizing that they are valuable, that their experiences are valid, and that very, very high support need difference does not make them any less than, right? Does not make them a burden, does not make them in any way defective, but it is just a tragedy of actuality that having anything like our current setup, providing support needs of that sort is going to be so far from what we're doing that we basically have to have a radically different world, right? So I don't think you're missing something in asking that question. I think it's a really great question to ask and one that has a very, very complicated and nuanced answer. But thanks for giving an opportunity to give voice to it.